please. Thank you. One more time, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to second day in the System Analysis and the Americans. And first of all, for the beginning this day and summary of previous day, I'd like to invite Mr. Ian Stewart, Head IIASA External Relations, Communications, and Labor Department, please.
So, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? No? No? Okay. Raise it a bit. Is that a bit better? Can you hear me? Closer? Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I'm a bit too tall for it, so there we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day. Before I start, I'd just like to say a big thank you to the Getúlio Vargas Foundation for giving us this great venue. Thank you. And also for our co-hosts and co-partners in this event, CAPES, National Academy of Sciences, and obviously IIASA too. Thanks also to all the speakers yesterday and everyone who contributed. And there's been a lot of people working behind the scenes, so I'd like to give a big thank you to there's a science committee, Elena, Michael, Roberto, who are here. We're all on the science committee. Thanks very much for helping to shape the program, and also on the organizing side. So thanks very much to Veronica, to Paula from Getúlio Vargas Foundation for helping a lot, from Pablo from CAPES, and Tom from IIASA for all your hard work. So my job today is to do a quick summary of what we covered yesterday. So we started yesterday with a really nice warm welcome from Mauro, from Albert, and from Goret. And then we went into a speech by Albert van Jaarsveld about the power of systems analysis. And here, the conclusion, the argument was very much using a lot of different examples from different parts of the world, how system solutions provide a better approach for dealing with today's complex problems. And we saw from the examples that systems analysis helps to find more effective outcomes, also can provide substantial cost savings, smarter, more cost-effective ways of doing things, and it's a great way also to deal with systemic risk. This then flowed into a really nice presentation by Mauricio Lopez, which very much looked at Brazil and looked at the agricultural sector and how systems thinking and nexus thinking is really critical for this area. And here we looked at a huge nexus of different things, looking at soil, water, energy, food, biodiversity, and climate, using agriculture as the example here, and showing that with systems analysis, you can think about agriculture and you can move it to a far more sophisticated system. So not just one that produces food, but one that achieves sustainable futures, and also multifunctionality in terms of the agricultural sector, not just for food, but as a way to manage a whole host of things from all the way up into different types of cuisine too. This was followed by a presentation by Carlos Nobre. He was looking very much at the challenges in the Amazon, and he worried and scared quite a lot of us, I think, in terms of how close the Amazon is potentially to a tipping point from deforestation, changing from forests to dry savannas. But he also gave us hope for the future and optimism, arguing that there was huge potential of a biodiversity-driven bioeconomy in the Amazon, and that there was a need for a system shift, often through disruptive technologies, to try and achieve that. The next session was looking at integrated ways of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And so we started with a speech by Bernardo Strasberg, and here he used restoration as the entry point. So one of the SDGs, how to restore degraded land, but there's also a lot of synergies in that in terms of achieving biodiversity, in terms of tackling climate change, and there's opportunity costs from taking this approach. And he also provided a practical look at some of the systems analysis. So systems analysis can very much help illuminate some of these synergies and some of these trade-offs, help to map them, help to quantify them, and help to provide actionable evidence. This then flowed into a speech by Naki from IIASA, Nakicenovic, where he spoke very much about a project called The World in 2050, which is looking at how to achieve and implement the Sustainable Development Goals in an integrated manner. Here there's 6 major transformations that are recommended as a means to do that. He argued very much that the world is at a crossroads. There's huge potential if we take advantage of the synergies, but there's risks too. And so we have to work out how to minimize the trade-offs. And he delved into one example of digitalization. We looked at the mobile phone, how it's changed over the last 20, 30 years, but how digitalization has offered huge potential in terms of helping to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but there's also risks, and we have to be aware of those and try and minimize them. And then in the afternoon, we had a panel discussion, and one of the main focuses on the panel discussion was trying to identify challenges for systems analysis in the Americas. And here we had various different speakers recommended different areas to look at. So Eduardo de Resende Francisco talked about big data and seeing one of the big challenges for systems analysis is the integration of analytical techniques and the introduction of new methods like artificial intelligence and machine learning. Secondly, we had a speech by Jose Eduardo Bofino from Embrapa, arguing how systems analysis can help reduce the climate risks for farmers, and a more system analytical approach, a more integrated approach can find some really smart solutions. Mike Clegg, the chair of IIASA's Governing Council, gave a nice summary of a study from the National Academies about food and nutrition insecurity, and has, which was a really nice example of a study that crossed all the Americas. And this is one of the areas that IIASA is particularly good at, is looking at areas that cross international boundaries. Then we had Eduardo Fracassi, who had this great simulator, and we're going to hear about it more later today. But very much he was pointing out that we need to engage the public in some of these complex issues to help achieve the implementation and achieve the solutions. And then Alberto Palomba, the waterman, came in at the end explaining how building sustainable water, to do it properly, it requires a broader look. So not just looking at the water sector, but that there were some real win-win situations by looking at water, energy, food, climate change, and land use sectors altogether. And then this same question came up in the following session. So here at IIASA, we've been thinking quite a lot about some of the challenges for systems analysis, and we polled you about some of the ideas that we've had, and the feedback coming back was the most important challenges for the Americas from the group that we'd identified was governance, innovation, institutions, and natural resources. And then coming out of the discussion, there were 2 broader areas that perhaps we hadn't thought so much about, which was looking at education and communication. So that's my short summary of yesterday. What I would quite like to take advantage of this little opportunity. Quite a few people have been asking me about IIASA and have been asking me about how, so we're obviously talking about systems analysis and everybody's interested in this, but they've been asking me about how they can engage in IIASA, if there's sort of mechanisms for proper engagement. So if you permit me, like 1 minute, I will explain some mechanisms. So some of you are already working very much with IIASA and you know how to work with IIASA, but some of you are new to IIASA. And so I wanted to just sort of explain some of these mechanisms. That's the question, how can I engage with IIASA? This is where we are. So it's a very nice venue. We're based in Austria. That's all thanks to the Austrian government. So it's a great venue to come, and we give researchers access to new knowledge, new ways of looking things, new methodologies, new data, new partnerships. The main sort of mechanisms depends a bit on what level you are in your sort of research career. But for PhD students, we have a Young Scientist Summer Program. Students come and spend 3 months at IIASA in the summer. We have various different postdoc programs. These are available at that website. Also, there's lots of employment opportunities at IIASA, so keep an eye at our website. We have about 80 newcomers coming to IIASA each year. There's quite a large number of our workforce is also part-time, so people employed by one employer in their home country, and then they come for a short period IIASA. One of the things that's not there is also we have a guest scholar program. So if you have your own money, you can come and join the guest scholar program, provided there's a substance link between your work and what IIASA is doing in some of its research programs. We have various conferences, and so we attract quite a lot of visitors and conference participants. On the next slide, I'll give you a link that you can sign up for our newsletter and for our publications, and so we can keep you informed about events coming up at IIASA. And obviously, a lot of what we do is sort of grassroots collaborations, researcher to researcher, so there's opportunities to work with our researchers on publications together, and also work with our researchers on externally funded projects. So this is if you have a great idea and you're talking to IIASA researchers and together you find a great idea, is to go out and try and find external funding for that project and together build a consortium and work together on that. And we're always interested in developing new mechanisms. We've just come from a couple of days in Brasilia where we've been talking with CAPES and the ministry here about potential new mechanisms, and these conversations will go on, and hopefully we'll be able to provide more information about more opportunities in the future. And that's the last one. So if you're interested in keeping in touch with IIASA, there's this website called iasa.ac.at/keep in touch, and you can sign up for our publications, and we'll keep you informed about the opportunities here. Okay. Yes. Yes. Yeah. There's publications outside. Please help yourself. Please take them out. Okay. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Sorry. So let's begin the first session. It's about system analysis to handle volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity to aid policy making. So innovations in new quantitative and qualitative methods from areas including mathematics, statistics, operation research, and management science for addressing problems arise in the policy analysis of the complex social environment systems. So I'd like to invite Ms. Elena Rovenskaya, please, for introduce this keynote speaker, acting as a Deputy Director, General and CEO and Program Director. IIASA Advanced Systems Analysis Program, please.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it's good for me. All right. Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see you here. And I have the pleasure to talk today about some of the methodological advances that we are doing at IIASA. And we decided to frame this session using this concept that I'm sure many of you have heard about before. It's called VUCA, where V, U, C, and A stand for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So these are the four overarching, cross-cutting challenges that systems analysis really has to deal with in the 21st century. So volatility obviously has to do with changes over time. Different processes, as we know, change quite fast, so there can be also abrupt changes. That is what we are observing every day, I think. Uncertainty is yet another really profound challenge, and what follows in my presentation, I will give you an example of how we deal with uncertainty in decision-making, in decision support tools. Then, of course, the world is becoming more and more interconnected, and that is denoted here by this notion of complexity. Complexity is ever growing. The current world is, I guess, undoubtedly more complex than anything that we had before in the past. And finally, ambiguity. Here by ambiguity, what we mean is the different stakeholder interests, which are only partially realized. Sometimes they have interests that they don't even fully consciously realize. Then there could be lots of conflicts because between those interests, and all that we call by this word ambiguity. So these four big challenges, they are really, really essential for any public policy planning problem. be it a problem from economics or resource management or finance or whatever field. Yeah? So it's interesting that what kind of methods we actually use to support decisions in public policy planning and how they are in fact reflecting this kind of challenges. Do they really deal with those challenges in an appropriate way? So I think speakers yesterday already twice quoted Einstein, so I also do it here by another quote. So this quote is saying the following: how can it be that mathematics, being after all a product of human thought, which is independent of experience, is so admirably appropriate for the objects of reality? Obviously, Einstein said it about physics and natural sciences at large. Yeah? But what happened then, mainly in the second half of the 20th century, is that mathematics as a language and as a tool, as a source of tools, has also been applied to problems in economics, social sciences, resource management, and so on. But, of course, naturally, that mathematics that was available at that time was applied to those problems. And that mathematics was not developed. Those mathematical methods were not customized or tailored to the challenges of those problems that we have to deal with. So these VUCA challenges, the 4 challenges I just talked about, they are actually much less present, or sometimes they are absent in the problems of natural sciences. Yet, in the problems that we deal in systems analysis, we do use methods that have been developed for those other problems. And this is really, really a big challenge. And therefore, we argue that we actually need a different mathematics. We need different methods that, in fact, are powerful to deal with those VUCA challenges. And this is the motto, if you like, in spirit of yesterday's discussion, the motto of IIASA in terms of methodological area. How do we advance methodologies of systems analysis? We really need to look for new methods to deal with volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. So in this talk, I would like to focus on uncertainty as one challenge, and specifically on how we can incorporate uncertainty in decision support tools. So what I'm presenting at this slide is very trivial for those who deal with these things, but still, let me show it very quickly. So if you talk about mathematical models which are used to support decisions, they are called decision support tools. Typically, they look like that. So you have a model of a real process. The model is this box here now on the slide. So in that model, you have 2 types of variables. You have decision variables. This is what you would like to define. And you have output variables. These are the results of those decisions. So normally in life, we are used to this kind of dependence. You make a decision and then you observe the output. That's a common way of perceiving this. Yeah? Decision support tools, they do the opposite. They define what we want to achieve, and on that basis, they derive the decision variables. This is in mathematics called solving an inverse problem. And then we have input parameters here that influence the model, and therefore influence our output parameters, and therefore they influence decisions. And these optimal decisions is what, at the end, we have. So it's very known in mathematics, but unfortunately often ignored or underestimated in practical modeling, that when you solve the optimization problem, which is an inverse problem, the propagation of uncertainty is much less straightforward than it is when you solve the direct problem. So if you solve the problem like this, that you have, first you have input parameters with uncertainty, and then they affect your decision variables, which then affect the output variables. Even if you have a nonlinear process, the propagation of uncertainty is straightforward. You can anticipate what the uncertainty of the output is if you know the uncertainty of the input. But this is not the case when you solve the inverse problem. When you solve an optimization problem, the propagation of uncertainty can be very, very not straightforward, and often, especially if your model is quite complex, you can hardly anticipate how the input uncertainty will translate into optimal decisions. And this is why one needs to have special methods to deal with this. It's not enough to just run a number of scenarios and believe that if you cover your input parameters by a number of scenarios, then you have dealt with uncertainty in an appropriate way. So at the IIASA, we developed methodologies to do that. They are rooted in stochastic optimization. I'm not going to discuss anything about mathematical details of those methods, but I'm going to show you an example of how they are used and what kind of value they create. So in this talk, I will talk about resource management problems, but you can also imagine this just as an example, and you can imagine any other decision support tool or any other way when you're any other situation in which you would like to derive decisions from optimization. And then the same what I will be talking about also applies to any other field. But I just talk about resource management problems just as an example. So in this case, we talk about decisions. And decisions can be really very, very many. For example, they can have to do with land allocation for different economic activities. They can have to do with technologies that are used, for example, in the energy sector. They can be about investments in different sectors or in different projects, in different development projects. They can have to do with crops, with fertilizers that are used, with different environmental technologies, cleaning technologies, and so on. So the decisions are really, really very different ones. And then uncertainty. Again, there is a range of uncertainties that would influence resource management problems. Some of them are listed here on this slide. For example, one really very important uncertainty is about water. It's about precipitations and how much water is available for agriculture and for energy, as I will show then later. It also has to do with temperatures. It has to do with some economic uncertainties, such as, for example, market prices. So all these uncertainties and many others, they affect decisions, as I just explained on the previous slide, and they have to be accounted if we want to have reliable decision support tools. So in the next several slides, I will show you an example. Again, look at it just as an example, and you can imagine many other examples where the same methodology could be applied. So for illustration purposes, I'm giving you this example. And the example has to do with food, water, energy nexus in a province of China that is called Shaanxi province. Food, water, energy nexus already has been discussed during this conference many, many times. So I don't need to convince you that these three sectors must be considered in the nexus. They are tightly connected. The reason why they are connected is that water is really limited, and we cannot anymore plan water allocation for food sector separate from energy sector. They must be considered in the nexus, in the connection. And that is especially true in regions such as Shaanxi province in China, where on the one hand, this is a region that is very rich in terms of coal reserves, and they have a lot of coal mining activities in this region. On the other hand, exactly this region is very scarce in terms of water. So this is where this nexus issue is really, really binding the decisions already now. And of course, with growing demands and with growing standards of living, this kind of constraints will become only more important than they are now. So the question, therefore, is how can we ensure that the water is used by the two sectors, by food and energy, in an appropriate way, given that we, in fact, do not know how much water is available and will be available next year, the year after, and so on. So how can we plan given that uncertainty? So for that, as I said, we have developed methodologies that are based on stochastic optimization. And we applied those methodologies to a model that I briefly outline here. So we have a model in which we decide on the crop allocation in that province. So what kind of crops to grow and where. And we decide on coal mining, because the whole province is very rich in coal, and they only mine in certain areas. They don't mine everywhere. So where exactly to locate the mines and how much coal to mine is the question here, given that there is this really tight water constraint. So the model decides on those decision variables. And one message that we can show from this model right away is that and that again was mentioned already many times, that one really has to be aware of the trade-offs that exist in this system. So the plot on the right-hand side here shows you the trade-off curve, or the Pareto frontier as it's sometimes called, between the crop production, so between the food sector, and between coal production, so the energy sector. So obviously, if you want to produce more coal, you must sacrifice a certain amount of production of crops and vice versa. So this kind of models, in the first results that you can get from that is to understand how this curve looks like. And in this case, so it's here, so one can really see how many tons of crops you sacrifice to produce 1 ton of coal and vice versa. How many tons of coal you must sacrifice in order to produce 1 more ton of crop. So instead of giving one scenario or one solution, one can actually look at this curve, and then it's up to decision makers to decide where they want to locate themselves on this curve. But they must be aware that it's not possible to be above the curve. So the resources are simply not enough for that. So that is a very classical analysis, and this is very relatively easy to understand. So now we bring in uncertainty. So if you look at the historical variation of the water availability, and if you look at how this different water availability actually influence this trade-off curve, so then the result of that you can see on the left-hand side of this slide. So in fact, if you consider a typical dry year for the Shanxi province and compare it with a typical wet year of the same province, you can see, so the wet year is the upper curve and the dry year is the lower curve, that the difference between the crop production that they can afford is actually threefold. And that means that depending on what year you have, you actually make completely different decisions of what crops to grow, because different crops, of course, require different amount of water, where to grow it, because, again, the distribution of water in the region is also not even, and so on. So, so this picture really shows that you cannot just plan based on some scenarios, because scenario to scenario, your decisions are so much different. And then, obviously, in the future, you don't know which scenario you realize. So how do you make a decision? Which curve do you prefer? If you prefer the lower curve, for example, you can plan conservatively. Then obviously you lose out. If the year happens to be wet, then you simply underuse your resources. Obviously, if you plan based on an optimistic scenario, then it doesn't realize, and then you are also losing your upfront investments that you have made. So what people typically do, they take some kind of mean values, and they believe that, well, on average, this must be fine. So in the next slides, I will show you how one can do better. So how one can do better? We can use this stochastic optimization to derive so-called risk-adjusted decisions, where we in fact make use not of the mean values of our uncertain parameter, but of the entire distribution. So from the history, we do know how the water availability actually behaves. We know how many dry years one should expect, how many wet years, how many average years, and so on. So there is this statistics, and if we have reasons to expect that it doesn't change much into future, so let's say in the next several years, it's a reasonable assumption, so then we can take this uncertainty as a distribution into consideration and plan based on that information instead of just mean values. And so what is the advantage of that? Let me show it on this slide. So first of all, the whole paradigm of planning changes, because if you want to plan by accounting to uncertainty, what you have to do, you have to forget about this idea that you can use, that you can plan your resources in some kind of deterministic way. Instead, you change the way how you think about planning, and you start to plan based on so-called, in mathematics it's called chance constraints, meaning that you define the level or the probability with which you can satisfy certain constraints. For example, if it's about water, you say with a certain probability, with 90% probability, for example, I would like to plan in such a way that I use only the water that is available in the region. I have to define this probability with which I plan this. And if it happens so that for example, the year is particularly dry, then I have to apply some kind of adaptive measures or ex-ante measures to compensate for that. But in all other cases, in all these other 90% of cases, I'm fine. I use only the water that is available in the region. So this critical probability threshold or reliability threshold is an important parameter in this kind of planning. And again, it's up to decision makers to decide. Do they want to be very conservative and say, I would like to plan in such a way that with 99% probability, I only use my own resources. I don't need to import water, or I don't need to do some other measures to compensate for that shortage. Or you can relax that and say, I take a risk, and I only set up, for example, 80% probability, and if this 20% are realized, then I see what to do. Yeah? So this is really up to decision makers then to define that level. And what we as scientists and modelers can do, we can show them this now, another trade-off that is illustrated on this picture, where you have the so-called penalty cost and the reliability level. So this curve shows you, depending on which reliability level you choose, you have a certain penalty that you impose on your producers. This can be, if you want to reduce the penalty, this can be a subsidy. If you want to increase the penalty, this can be additional taxes or additional payments that you ask them to pay. So you can regulate, as a planner of that region, you can regulate the cost for the producers to satisfy their constraints, and by that you regulate the reliability level. And you tell them, yeah, if you choose this reliability level, this costs so much, and if you choose other one, of course, it costs more. And in this way, they can plan. So on the and one can quantify this dependence, and we did it for the Shaanxi region as this. Yeah? So that has implication for the total cost of the whole production in the region, both agriculture and coal. And again, one can see that the higher this penalty cost is, so the higher is reliability. Penalty is translating into reliability, as you can see. So the higher is this penalty cost, of course, the higher is the total production. But if you really want to be sure, if you really want to minimize risks, which means you are here in this area, the costs, the extra costs you have to pay are not so high. So the blue line here is the total cost. And you can see that after a certain level, it's actually the additional incremental cost is really not so big, but you can gain a lot in terms of this reliability. Yeah? And this is for this region. For the other region, it can be different. So one really has to quantify this kind of dependencies in order to have really, sufficient information for this kind of planning. Here, this slide illustrates that what would happen if you didn't apply this more sophisticated method based on stochastic optimization, and if instead you would use mean values. So what we see here is the total cost to produce the same amount of, or to satisfy the same amount of the same demand for crops and coal. So the total cost of the risk-adjusted solution is here by this blue line, and the total cost of the same demands, but if you apply the mean values, if you ignore the distribution, is actually here. So the numbers are very small, but you can believe me that the difference between this mean value-based solution and the stochastic one is about 5%. So you can save about 5% of the total costs, which are quite big. So this is a huge amount in absolute terms. So you can save about 5% of the cost if you take account of the entire distribution of your uncertainty, which in this case is water, compared to just taking the mean values. So this is really the financial gain that one can get by applying this more sophisticated methods. And the same, more or less the same, is illustrated on this slide, just a little bit differently. So it's called the value of stochastic solution. This is exactly this difference that I just discussed. And you can see that, again, depending on the penalty cost or on the reliability levels, of course, this difference is different. And if you want to be really risk-averse, so if you set really a very low-risk target, so then, of course, you have to pay more, and then this value of stochastic solution gets even higher. So you gain more if you want to be risk-averse. And again, one can quantify exactly how much you can gain. Interestingly, in this specific example, one can also estimate the so-called expected value of perfect information. So what would happen if we knew which kind of year to expect? Yeah, if somehow we have really the best possible ways to predict weather and water, and we don't have the uncertainty. What if we can reduce the uncertainty? Maybe it's better to invest in that. And by doing that, maybe we can plan better. Yes, of course we can. But the light red line here illustrates that. In fact, what you can gain from that is just 1%. This is in this particular region. It can be different in different regions. But again, it's important to know, what is the better investment? Is it better to invest in more information available about the uncertainty? Or it's better to invest in this kind of solution, which accounts for the entire distribution. Yeah? And you can compare these different gains and then decide where you would like to invest. In this case, especially if you want to be risk averse, it makes sense to invest in this kind of stochastic solutions. In some other cases, it can be different. So this is an example that illustrates how one can deal with uncertainties in a more sophisticated way than it's commonly done. And I hope it's convincing. And you can also think of applying this not to just this example, which is crops and coal in China, but you can think of many other problems where you can apply it. Some of them are listed here. It can be energy production, can be food production, again, separately. It can be fisheries, forestry, pollution control, and so on. So any problem where you have uncertainty and where you make decisions based on optimization is subject to the same kind of method, and yeah, one can apply it. So if there is interest to try to apply it to your area, it's very much welcome, and we would be more than happy to collaborate about that. I think on the next slide, I also decided to advertise some options of collaborating with IIASA. So my colleague Ian Stewart already mentioned even more than actually I have here, but I would particularly like to highlight this Young Scientist Summer Program. This is an opportunity for PhD students to come to IIASA for 3 months in summer to work with us together on a joint project that eventually should become a research paper, a chapter in the dissertation, or anything new that a student would like to try, maybe outside of his or her PhD studies. So it's a highly competitive program, but the best students are selected, and then from all over the world, about 50 students come every summer to our castle that is here to participate in this exciting program. So I very much invite everybody to look at the website that advertises this and the conditions, and really consider applying. So other options are postdoc programs. Again, was already mentioned, different ways of collaborating between scientists and scientists, such as guest contracts and different other positions that we have open, and they are all advertised at our website. So one can, at any moment of time, have a look and see what's available. Yeah, consider joining us, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ms. Elena. Well, let's continue. I would like to invite you, the keynote speaker, too. Sorry. Mr. Edmundo Molina Perez, please. Associate Research Professor, the School of Government and Public Transformation of Tech of Monterrey, please.
Morning, everyone. I titled my talk today Systems Analysis in the Great Acceleration. And really what I want to discuss with you today is some methods for addressing this condition, describe briefly some experiences that we have implemented, that we have had in implementing these methods in the region. And then at the end, I would like to share with you my thoughts on what are research avenues for this exciting area of work. So let's start with the methods. What is true is that we're living through a great acceleration. And what you can see in this chart is basically you can see from the 1800s how we have been changing across regions and time in terms of population, real GDP, foreign direct investments, water use, telecommunications, large dams. And what you can see in all of these charts is that over the last couple centuries, well, things are just getting quicker and quicker, right? And this is partly because of technological change. Not only we have more technologies, but these technologies are combined in novel ways, and every time that becomes more unpredictable, and that accelerates change. Those socioeconomic changes are also changing our Earth systems. And you can see here in this chart how that change in the technological and the economic system is actually, causing a lot of changes too on the Earth system. And you can see, of course, that happening with carbon dioxide, but also with other components as land use and other chemical components in the atmosphere. So the combination of those two things, and also our ever more tribal view of science, is just creating a complex environment for system analysis. What you can see in this chart actually is very interesting. On the horizontal axis, you're seeing basically a measure of how well you are versed with scientific concepts, and on the horizontal axis, you're basically measuring how well you get an answer with respect to climate change, and as a function of your scientific background. And you can see there's a very nice correlation when you see across the entire population. But if you break this correlation down by political affiliation, so the blue line being liberal Democrat and the red line being a Republican conservative, then you can see that it doesn't really matter how well versed you are in scientific concepts and your education. You will basically judge scientific evidence first through the lens of your political preferences. So those two things, that first, that we are in a great acceleration both in the socioeconomic and the Earth sphere, and that basically our understanding of science is crumbling because of our political changes, makes it every time more difficult to predict, to rely on predictions. And this is an example of this week. This is the Dorian Hurricane. And what you can see is that how the forecasts change basically every day, right? So if you were here before the weekend, you would expect the impact of the hurricane in Florida, right? But then, as the president of the United States and other officials began to, use the information, let's just say, on a responsible way, and the scientific information began being updated, then the forecast changed really quickly. So just imagine, how do you plan for this? So there's millions of people that could be potentially impacted by this hurricane in a very short period of time. And this is a nice picture that, this is being caused by both the changes we are causing on the Earth systems, the way we are handling science, and basically the assets at risk are a result of, how technology and economy are quickly changing every day. So the RAND Corporation invented a couple decades ago a concept, a framework that is known as robust decision making, which is decision support framework that consists of 5 phases that actually, is designed to actually deal with these sort of situations. So in RDM, everything starts with decision structuring, right? So that's one of the key components of the framework, which is you need to structure what are the decisions being on the table, basically by interacting with real problems, with real policy context, and with real stakeholders. And then what RDM has become really, let's say, famous or well used is because this participatory scoping work usually results in the need to consider a vast set of policies and a vast set of potential future circumstances. That the only way you can actually explore through all of them is through the use of high computing resources. So basically, this interaction gives you the inputs to design a computational experiment, often of large proportions. And once you run this experiment and you produce this very vast set and rich set of results, then this is the job for machine learning, data science, and artificial intelligence techniques. Once you have that set of information, then you have to use these statistical techniques to understand what are the key factors driving vulnerabilities and how you can adapt to those vulnerabilities such that you can increase the robustness of a given plan or a given decision context. And of course, the whole idea of RDM is that you have to do this iteratively, right? So you participate with the decision makers, then you run the experiments, you do the statistical analysis. But the interesting thing with RDM is that you do this in close collaboration with stakeholders. And because of this reason, over the last 15 years, there's been a growing set of applications of RDM all over the world. And what I would like to discuss today with you is just a recently published application of RDM in the context of Latin America. All right, so moving on to experiences. Over the last 3 years, we developed at Tech of Monterrey in collaboration with the RAND Corporation. We developed this study, which was basically helping the city of Monterrey design their water investment portfolio for the next 3 decades, considering, as you can see on our title, economic, climate, and technological uncertainties. So let me go through the case study to clarify this. So, Monterrey is one of the biggest, the big cities in Mexico. It's, one would say, the capital of the industrial cluster between Mexico and the United States. It's a rapidly expanding city in terms of population and economy, like many cities in Latin America, going through the same phase of change. And that rapid expansion is occurring, is basically stressing available supplies, both water and other natural resources. And what makes this interesting is that these cities are growing, like Mexico City and Sao Paulo did in the 70s, but the planning context has completely changed. Resources are much more scarce, needs are much more stressed, and you have climate change. You want to plan for water investments, you want to build a new dam, you want to build a new set of wells, or maybe a new aqueduct. Well, things are very different today because you don't really know how much water you will be able to derive from those sources because of climate change, and because you don't know if other cities in the future will go after those same resources. So when we did this study, it was very interesting political environment because the previous state administration had proposed the implementation of a very large and expensive transfer project, which had created a lot of political opposition. It was a very polarized political environment because on the one hand you had a lot of opposition, but then you also had a lot of drive for expanding the water supply through this new aqueduct because the city is in fact in need of new waters. So what this slide shows, this is the proposed aqueduct. So this is the city of Monterrey, near the border with the United States. And the idea was to build this, 300 kilometers, almost 400 kilometers aqueduct that will bring water from the south of Mexico into Monterrey. And this sounds ludicrous, right? When you look at it, well, it is ludicrous, but this is the way 90% of the capitals in the world have expanded their water supplies. So it's, as I was telling you, this is completely different times. And what immediately happened when this project was proposed is that the local community was immediately, a complete polarized political environment was produced as a result of this project. Proponents of the project will say that this was a very efficient, proven technology, a proven way of bringing water into the city. Which is an important point. And opponents will be, basically focus on all the environmental impacts and the potential fiscal burden that this project will become. And this is the political environment in which we actually had the opportunity to do an RDM study. So this is interesting because sometimes in academia you have to kind of lose your comfort zone, and when you start working with politicians and you realize that they don't have the same time windows as a scientist has. And basically the analysis worked in two phases. The first phase was a very quick phase, like 6 months. The new governor of the state wanted to make a decision, as you can imagine, not in 2 years, but in 6 months, so he could tell people that he was doing something. And this was an interesting thing, because what we agreed with him is that we will do the analysis in 6 months, but it will be with the best available tools and evidence that we could gather in 6 months. So there will be a lot of limitations. But the deal was that if the first phase was successful in identifying future avenues of work, then the government will be committed to a 3-year research project. So the first phase, basically what we did is we assessed whether or not the aqueduct was a good idea. And what we found is that in a lot of futures, on a lot of scenarios, it wasn't really the best cost-effective investments. And this led to, as I told you, a 3-year research project really diving into more detail with respect to how to plan for the long term in terms of water infrastructure in the state. So what we did is we took a diversified water planning approach. So in the second phase, we didn't focus on just one project. We talked with a lot of stakeholders, and we focused on a very diverse ecosystem of projects. We developed the planning tools necessary to evaluate the pros and cons of those projects. And we explore a lot of potential vulnerabilities: economic, climate, and of course technological vulnerabilities. And this study is actually pretty interesting, because in the end it really had a policy impact. And what happened is that, as you can read here in this news paper, the aqueduct, the original cost of the proposal was in the order of 60,000 million pesos, which is I think $3,000 million. And then you can see that out of this study, the state decided to take a diversified approach, and instead of spending that a huge amount of money, the master plan now costs just 1/10 of that investment and considers an adaptive approach. So what we did is, and this is what RDM is all about, is really true exhaustive stakeholder collaboration. Really, we are modelers, we are data scientists, but really we are not there to give an answer, or the framework is not designed to give an answer, it's designed to support deliberations. So what we did is we created an integrated assessment tool. And what I want to highlight here is that, for example, this tool is actually very interesting, because it has a model for water demand that is informed with all the water records of the local water utility company, and that only happens when you have like certain political buy-in, from all stakeholders. Like they give you 10 years of records, 2 million consumers, so you can calibrate your model. Then we have a model that basically explores how the different basins that are able to supply or could potentially supply water to the city behave. All that goes into a model that projects demand and hydrology. And the interesting thing about this model is that everything is coupled within water management model, which one of these softwares that is very well known. In this case was Riverware. But then everything is tied with optimization engine. So basically here we build this tool to help them understand, for a given set of future circumstances, what is the best dynamic path of investment that can help you meet both your reliability goals and at the same time minimize investments. So this is the tool, and the first step in any of these projects is to assess how vulnerable the system is if you do nothing. And this is what this graphic shows. Each line is showing time in the future. So this is the near-term future, the medium-term, and the very long-term future. The horizontal axis is showing different demand projections. Sadly, you cannot see the numbers, but to the right is, of course, more demand. To the left is less demand. And the vertical axis, what you're seeing is climate conditions. To the in the superior parts, you see less water, and in the inferior parts, you see more water available with respect to historical conditions. And the two columns are basically showing you, you know, high groundwater availability to the left and low groundwater availability to the right. So in a nutshell, what this graph's telling us, these are all the futures that we look at. So you can see this is a very vast set of potential future circumstances. And as you can see, everything is red, right? So the first thing that we clarify for stakeholders is that, yes, their intuition is right. They need to expand their water supplies. And that is a very important point of departure for any analysis. If you're not able to, you know, make this status quo assessment, it's just very difficult to frame anything else that will be incremental on top of this. What we did after this is that basically for all of those futures that I just explained, we basically determine which is the optimal investment path. And the idea is that that investment path should, you know, basically use cost-effectively the resources for any combination of future circumstances. And this is what you can see in this graph. On the columns here, you're seeing different demand scenarios. These are lower demand scenarios, and these are higher demand scenarios. And on the rows, you're basically just seeing, you know, the list of potential projects that could be implemented. And if you go and you explore a little bit through this list, you see there's desalinization, groundwater, new dams, efficiency, conjunctive use, wastewater injection. So very diversified ecosystem of alternatives. And and the color indicates when a given project is implemented. The darker color means you implement that from the beginning. The lighter blue one means you implement that in the midterm, and the gray one means you implement that in the long term. And what you start seeing from this sort of you know, estimation is that there are some projects. For example, look at this line over here. So this project, which is a groundwater well, a small groundwater well, you can see that almost in all demand futures, it makes sense to build that groundwater well. And there are some other projects, the big bet, for example, the aqueduct, you know, sorry, this is the desalinization and the aqueduct. You can see that, you know, just in some futures, it makes sense to build those projects. Now, this is just one set of futures, right? If you do this analysis for, you know, thousands of futures, then the story starts getting very interesting, because then you have a very rich data set. You have combinations of circumstances, and for each combination you have the optimal pathway for you know, addressing that circumstance. So for this study, we developed an approach to define robust adaptive strategies, which is a lot of what is the state of the art on the field. And basically the approach, what it does is does the experiment in two phases. The first phase identifies what are the low regret near-term investments that are available for decision makers. And then, you know, for the midterm or long term, the idea is that you develop a adaptive strategy. So through this optimization exercise and participatory analysis, we are able to identify this Pareto curve as a function of two dimensions. The horizontal axis is total regret cost, and the vertical axis is reliability regret. Regret is basically how much you would regret a given investment if another future materializes. So if cost regret is very high, that means that you overinvested in that future. So I built every project on the table, and for every future I fulfill my reliability objective, but a lot of the infrastructure remains idle. I don't use it. So if you have reliability regret, on the other hand, which is this top part of the curve, then that means that in a lot of futures you underinvested, right? You spent little money, you didn't spend a lot of money, but in a lot of futures your resources are stressed to the limit. And what you can see is this very nice Pareto curve in which, for the near term, in which, you know, a specific portfolio of projects sit right on the Pareto frontier. And then the line basically tells you how stable these preferences are in different parts of the probability distribution. And what I want to highlight from this figure is that in an RDM study, this Pareto curve, which is, you know, the classic microeconomic setting for decision making, but this is not one individual. This is a group of stakeholders being able to identify what is on the table in the short term based on analytical tools that help them assess that. So what do you do once you have this Pareto curve? What do you do in a normal setting? Well, you will get something like a constraint or a budget constraint in terms of these two metrics, and then you will use the tangential point that to the curve. That's not really what happens in an RDM context. What we do in an RDM context is basically create as much evidence as we can so we can facilitate the decision. And what we did in this study is that for every point in the Pareto frontier, we estimated what should be the adaptive strategy that fulfills reliability objectives by minimizing cost in the medium and long term. So stakeholders could compare what are the long-term implications of the short-term decisions for each one of these points in the Pareto frontier. You do that through successive optimizations. In this case, each one of those estimations will take around 1.9 million runs. So once more, that's kind of like a lot of FLAIR or RDM studies, like you do a lot of data crunches. And what is a robust, in this case, a robust adaptive strategy? What it does is the first decision on large controversial projects, and this is one of the adaptive strategies. So this is one point in the Pareto frontier, and sadly the text does not see very well. You cannot see very well, but what this strategy does in the long term is that it doesn't bet in any big project. The idea of this adaptive strategy is that it will meet requirements through a diversified approach, which is what you see here. It's a portfolio of small projects with a very low cost stack. And then in the medium and long term, basically this strategy will expand. The first hierarchy of decisions will be demand. If demand is low, then you don't need to expand. If demand is high, then you do a very large expansion. But sometimes demand is not the only driver of the adaptability. Groundwater availability also drives what sort of investments you should implement in the medium and long term. So once you estimate what is the, let's say, available adaptive strategy, then you have to estimate what is the potential impact of that strategy in reliability in the system. And then you can see the same figure that I showed you a moment ago, which was completely red. Now it's completely green, right? And I think this really brings home the message of the power of adaptability. In the short term, you can work with short-term, low-regret investments. And the medium and long term, if you adapt correctly, if you're able to infer correctly what needs to be changed, then you can basically have a system that is very resilient. As I told you, we evaluated all the options in this Pareto frontier, and that was also very interesting because it helped us clarify for a stakeholder what were the resilience, robustness trade-offs in the medium and long term. And actually, that's a very interesting take of the study. So this is another point in the Pareto frontier. This is the corresponding adaptive strategy. And now the whole planning mindset changes. Now you don't bet on diversification in the short term. You bet on a big dam on the short term. And what happens with your adaptive strategy? Well, it of course changes, but in which way it changes? Well, it changes in two ways. First, you can see that the thresholds at which full expansions of the systems are triggered change. In this case, this strategy triggers that high cost expansion at a lower threshold. So one could argue this is a less resilient adaptive strategy. But also the hierarchy of uncertainties that drive investments in the medium and long term changes. Now, groundwater no longer is important. What is important is the conditions on the basins. So this really what is telling us is that depending on what you choose today, you're basically also not only choosing what to do, but what would you be vulnerable against in the medium and long term. And that's a very intuitive concept, but what makes this study interesting is that this is empirically estimated for this study. So what are the outcomes? As I was telling you, very interesting. The Monterrey water plan is complete and moving towards implementation without the recommendation from this study. You can visit the water plan in this website. You will not find these complex trees there because, of course, the governor was not going to go through all of these trees. So he was basically, I just want 2 branches, right? So sometimes the work is you have to simplify it without really losing the essence of the analysis. And that's a tough work for a scientist. If you ask me, it's difficult to how you cut your baby in a way. Now, another thing of interesting of the study is that through this stakeholder engagement and the rigorous and in-depth evaluation of vulnerabilities, you're able to put on the table interesting, let's say, forward-thinking options. For example, in this case, network efficiency and conjunctive use, which were not in the table before the study, right? If you would ask the stakeholders, and I'm sure that's the same case in Brazil, as is the same case in Argentina or Peru, network efficiency is seen for rich cities. No, that's for the rich. No, you know, I mean, we don't have money for network efficiency. But what this study clarifies is that that is not true. Network efficiency is always a good investment because it's virtual water that is constant. It does not depend on climate change. And the same thing for other options that are, you know, could be forward thinking as well. That could initially be thought too complex or too expensive, but once you put them on this framework, you generate evidence that can help you understand how innovative or not these are. A new groundwater monitoring program was established. The water utility company used a lot of groundwater resources. In the future, the supply of the city will depend on a lot of groundwater, and they did not have you know, a department inside the company that could help them understand the dynamics and the history of their groundwater resources. So that was also a nice, interesting outcome of the study. And of course, you know, because of the political environment, now water planning in the state is not done by the state itself, but is done in collaboration with business community, NGOs, universities ourselves, and foreign partners as well. Okay, so where I see this thing going, I think there's two avenues of future research for this type of work. Here, what you're seeing is a picture of a recently inaugurated decision theater at Monterrey in Mexico City. These things are very famous. Everyone talks about them, and everyone is happy to show them when you visit. But I think there's really lots of research to be done in terms of understanding how we better transfer the skills and findings resulting of these complex studies in which you have complex models, you have complex data sets, you have complex statistical techniques in a way that makes sense for stakeholders. For example, many times I was giving this briefing to stakeholders. Yeah, it was not surprised 50% of the audience will fall asleep, even though you know it was for them the biggest risk, not making the right decision. So I think there's a huge avenue of research in terms of how we can use these sort of infrastructures to experimentally validate what are the best approaches for delivering briefing and for engaging with stakeholders when you have, you know, state-of-the-art technology supporting decision discussions. Now, the other thing, the other avenue of research is that as computational power is really every month becoming less and less expensive and more powerful, this sort of integration that I've just described, like optimization model with water management model, and huge experimental design, a supercomputing environment, with artificial intelligence algorithms and machine learning and visualization techniques are going to become more common. And you know, my guess is that you know any kid in the next 10 years will be able to do that on their own. But one of the things that you find as a researcher in this sort of things is that we are not equipped, or there are no methods or frameworks such that we can correct for error propagation in each one of the integration processes. So you have a nice optimization algorithm that uses evolutionary techniques. That requires some subjective selection of the parameters that will be used for estimation. And when you couple that with, you know, a machine learning algorithm that will identify what are the patterns in the resulting data set, well, that also requires certain judgment in terms of the parameters that we will use for that algorithm. And we don't really have any research that tells us what are right decisions in that respect. Many of the times you just choose whatever makes sense with your computational resources, but I think that we can definitely do better in that respect. We should really analyze how error propagation, when we integrate so many different tools, actually could impact decisions or, you know, give spurious results. Inference validation in these sort of complex models. I mean, these models are very complex. Integrating them is complex. And how do you validate them? Like, of course, they have to reproduce historical conditions, but is that enough? Is there something else? There's a lot of things being done here in the past for simple models or standalone models. And the idea here is, can we use that literature to actually make better judgments in terms of what we need to do forward and when it comes to decision making under deep uncertainty. And the last point is, there's a lot of talk in this field on adaptive pathways, and now everyone is doing adaptivity and adaptive pathways. But my opinion is a lot of that work is expert elicitation informed or qualitatively informed, which is not bad. But I think that at the same time that progresses, we need to continue pushing forward for the automated generation of statistically estimated pathways, such that we can have tools that can help decision-making contexts interact with, not just one pathway. I mean, usually when we talk about adaptive pathways, people think this, okay, I just need one pathway, and that should be enough. And what this study shows is that that is not enough. You really need to look at a full set of pathways and really discuss them with the stakeholders. And that's pretty much everything for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eduardo. Well, right now there's open for the questions in our receptionists help you with. They have microphone over there. Here we go.
Well, good morning.
With them,
I have.
Miss
I
Elena,
appreciate the
or
two.
take your seat over there.
Okay. Yeah.
Here we go.
I have a question to Miss Elena and Mr. Perez. I am Perez too. Well, I think what we are doing here, as a matter of fact, in my opinion, we want to transform all those techniques in public policies. Public policies. Of course, when we are developing those methods, and my best congratulations to you. In China, you have a success to transform all these methods in an action, in a public policy, in a decision. And you too, in Monterrey. In my case, I developed stochastic process to recharge electric vehicles without any trouble with the electric system, without burning of transformers. Okay? Well, but for me, there is a big problem, or a big, when you go to the public policy. And do you have a method to convince the politicians? Do you know a method to, because what we are doing is to pick up this series and go to, and offer it to the society. Then it's a big wall between these theories, between us and the society, because our dream is to have this everything in benefit of the society. Then I would like to hear you about these questions.
Okay, I think that's a very interesting question. I think working for politicians is difficult because they want things quick. They want to sell their own interests, and they don't want to pay for the research. So What I'll tell you is that two things help. The first is that an RDM and this sort of techniques is very suited for that. Is that you're not really given an answer, and that opens the door when you say, "I'm not going to tell you what to do," right? So. And really, what helps, at least what helped in Monterrey, and what has helped in the previous cases we've done, is that you're there to facilitate the process. And when you are clear with that message, it opens doors, because then people want to talk to you. And then I think there's also the second factor. I think also is the entrepreneurial spirit that, as I was telling you, politicians are not keen to pay for this sort of research. So I think you have to be entrepreneurial in that respect. I mean, if the end user is not going to pay for the research, maybe the public has an appetite for that, and then that helps as well, right? When you are informing a decision that is funded, the effort is funded through different parties, then that creates a nice process of interaction. In which you're not there to give an answer but to facilitate it, and in which the resources have, basically been donated by different agents.
Yeah, I think. Yeah. Yeah, there are different ways, of course, and there is no one formula that can. Unlike these formal methods where there is a formula, in dealing with politicians, there is no formula, of course. Yeah, in different cases, different methods work, and we do have some, a handful actually of different approaches how to deal with them, and sometimes they are really successful. Maybe I want to highlight, in addition to what has been said, I want to highlight another aspect, and that is the role of IIASA to educate future policymakers. Because that is, of course, not unique function for IIASA. I think Grand Corporation equally contributes to that, but in particular IIASA, and we do see it also in practice, that, for example, through this Young Scientist Summer Program that was mentioned many times. So people participate just for 3 months in that program, and then some of them become professors and scientists, but some of them actually do go to policy sphere, but they remain aware, and they remain appreciative to this kind of methods. And sometimes that happens, maybe less often that we would like that to see, but it does happen that 10 years later or 15 years later, we found a person that was involved with IIASA many years ago, now in a powerful position, and then it's much, much easier than to discuss and to even have a project and actually even have them pay for that project, because of course in that case there is much more understanding and much more appreciation. So there are these success stories. They are maybe not many, but they are, and therefore I do think that for IIASA this is really one of the key missions also to do this kind of education, in quotation marks, education of future policymakers. And if that is achieved, if that is really, if the scale of that activity is sufficient, then maybe we don't have even these questions 20 years later or down the line.
Every day, almost every day, I receive a lot of questions. For example, in the future, artificial intelligence and robots will destroy a lot of professionals, like drivers and things like that. But I've never received any question about, and the politicians. What do you think about that? Do you know, or is it possible to predict, to substitute them by, or to help them with all those techniques? This is, I would like to think with you about that.
Yeah, no, I think that politicians are the least feasible automated profession, so they're safe in that respect. But no, I think, and you know, politics is it's important. I mean, if effectively carried out is the way we can, you know, discuss and bargain over our differences. So I think the big message here is that these tools can facilitate a process. And what is paradoxical here is that because these tools, in a way, are perceived as objective, you know, and evidence-based analytical tools, they often find their application and usefulness in policy processes, which that's exactly what you need. I mean, what I've seen the last few years is that politicians are tired of you know, experts telling them what to do, right? I mean, and then you have different experts suggesting different pathways. And I think, once again, artificial intelligence, exploratory models, supercomputer resources can help facilitate a discussion. And I think that's kind of like the big thing here. I mean, there's a lot of interesting stuff in all of this, like the statistical part, the computational architectural part. That's of course very exciting if you're a scientist. But I think for politicians, what they find attractive is that they find a platform that facilitates discussions with their with the network of stakeholders that are basically upset or worried about a particular course of action.
Yeah, maybe I say something anecdotal to this question, and of course it's a logical question, and maybe, I don't know, in 50, 100 years time, this will be an important question. Maybe now it's a little bit too early to worry about that. And to bridge there, maybe one consideration is that we discussed yesterday about IIASA and the strategic planning that the Institute is now doing. So that is a typical decision problem. And this is a typical problem under uncertainty and all these different aspects. And now you can ask us how much of our own methods that we are advertising and promoting and suggesting to the world, how much of that we are actually using to make our own decisions internally. And this is, of course, not only about IIASA, this is about each and every scientific organization. When I talk to colleagues, and reforms is something that people do almost all the time, it looks like. But how much of that is in fact informed and supported by this kind of methods? Maybe not so much, yeah? So maybe what we could do on this way is to start from ourselves, first of all, and test all these methods also in application to ourselves, and then, you know, then hoping that eventually politicians can also, maybe being impressed by our successes, then they can then also adopt those methods.
I have more of a methodological question, but before I ask the question, it took me at least 5 years to actually start to incorporate adaptive thinking under uncertainty for my own decisions. So it takes some time. There's another observation is that in political processes, uncertainty is not really on the agenda because, you know, if you're a strong leader, then you don't admit uncertainty and you always know the right path because then you project credibility, so to say. And people don't really understand much of it. But for example, in the business sector, you see a lot of understanding for stochastic processes and depreciation. But now to the question. We have seen now 2 presentations of robust decision-making. However, the figures didn't look the same, so there must be some deeper difference in the 2 methodologies. Could you elaborate a little bit on this? Because I think they are actually different. I think you are working with the Rob Lampert methodology.
Yes. Well, that's a very good question because I think, as I was talking at the end, right? I mean, there's so much statistical details on the connections and the framework that to actually be able to say what are the exact differences, then you really had to sit down and see what differences are. Yeah, I mean, this work is more RAND-like work. I mean, RDM was invented at RAND, I don't know, like maybe a couple decades ago. And RDM is powered by two paradigms. The first paradigm is exploratory modeling, which is the use of simulation models, not for prediction or forecasting, but more as laboratory. And of course, you know, with exploratory modeling, the idea was really do that exploration not just for a few sets of cases, but really use supercomputing power that could allow you to explore, you know, millions, hundreds of thousands of potential parametrizations or scenarios in a model. And the second component of RDM is that, well, once you have that huge database, right? For example, in the case of Monterrey, you're basically optimizing every feature, getting the dynamic optimal pathway. Then the database is just very rich, right? The database is just going to have a lot of information in it. But impossible for a human being to actually see those patterns. So the second component is really applying artificial intelligence to that database, so you can infer what are the key drivers of a vulnerability. So and with the recent applications, what we have become better at, I mean, those two concepts exist 20 years ago. What has happened in the last 10 years is that you have now cloud computing, and you know, any person can access hundreds of artificial intelligence and machine learning algorithms through Python or R, which are very simple programming languages, and that has opened a huge door for you know, taking these concepts into reality.
Yeah, I think the concept of robust decisions is the same. So obviously, it's a decision that is good enough for many, if not all, realizations of uncertainty. So as a concept, I think it's the same. The question, of course, is in details, how exactly it's implemented. Maybe one issue to highlight here is that where does this uncertainty come from? So how do we quantify, and how do we know, or how do we describe the uncertainty? So the simplest way that I showed is that you simply rely on the historical data, and that, of course, the simplest you can do. You can apply more sophisticated things using machine learning. You can project this uncertainty into future. And finally, what is really challenging, and where I think this should go, and in simple models, I think that has been implemented, but there is no theory, really like rigorous mathematical theory, is what if your decisions actually change the uncertainty? So right now, uncertainty is something that is just that comes in as input. Yeah. So it can be that decisions are actually shaping uncertainty, which of course is very often the case in reality. Mathematically, unless it's a very simple model, mathematically it becomes really, really challenging task to develop this theory. And this, to my knowledge, hasn't been done in general enough case. And so that is, I think, methodological challenge that we must address.
With Yuri, we have this one paper on induced discounting.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah, in specific. Yeah, I know. I'm aware of that paper. Yeah. So in specific cases, when specific functional forms and with specific, relatively simple assumptions, one can do that, but there is no coherent theory in general enough class of problems, and that I think is really what we should work on.
Any question? Okay, so it's time for the coffee break, and return in a few minutes. Thank you.
dois, três. 1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
1, 2, 3.
Som.
Um, dois, três.
So. Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
depois da fala dele vão ter as perguntas.
O Tom passou isso para mim.
As perguntas.
Isso.
Então, assim, ele vai falar, a placa dele tá onde? Tá ali, eu vou botar de qualificação. Então, tá, botar. Já pode botar. Não, tá. Pode botar quando ele começar, mas aí depois que ele acabar, vai ter as perguntas. Eu não sei se ele vai ficar em pé ou se ele vai sentar.
Isso é só agora, porque na próxima volta ao normal. Ladies and gentlemen, let's continue. There's a second part. About it, this section is energy and new technologies. So the future energy transitions, their implications for human well-being and the environment, as well as the partners, drivers, constraints, and impacts of technological change, particularly in the areas that are key for framing global sustainability conditions. I would like to invite speak this session, Mr. Roberto Schaeffer, Professor of Energy Economics, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. I'm glad to see many colleagues here in the audience. I'm sorry not to have too many people here. I would like to see much more, but anyway. The idea here, let's say, is to go briefly over this issue of energy and new technologies and try to show how, let's say, system analysis has been used here in Brazil to address some of these issues. And I'm going to focus on some interesting issues about the difference in scenarios in Brazil between a 1.5 world and a 2C world. And just to show that, which is very interesting, that I'm going to try to show that a 1.5 world is not an improvement of a 2C world, but in the case of Brazil, is a completely different world. And only a system analysis approach can give you this information. So very briefly, I'm going to very briefly introduce our research group in our university, very briefly talk about our, very briefly discuss the modeling tools we have been developing in our university, and then use some applications to show the power of this kind of tools. Very briefly, we are part of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and inside that we have COPE, which is the Graduate School of Engineering of the university. Then we have the Energy Planning Program inside this graduate school. And then we have the Synergia Lab, which is the lab where we run most of our projects. Very briefly, our program was created exactly 40 years ago. It's the first energy program in Brazil. And out of this program, we have some ministers that have graduated from our program, heads of big companies, etc., etc. And we are 13 full-time professors. Every year we accept roughly 20, 25 master students, 20, 25 PhD students. And according to CAPES, we have a score equal to 6 in a range from 1 to 7 in terms of quality of our research. And in the energy group, only our program has this score equal to 6. The other programs in Brazil are 5 or 4, so we are the only ones with grade number 6. Okay, very briefly about our research lab and the kind of work we have been doing over time. And it's very important to pinpoint here the importance that IIASA has had for our group. Most of our, if not all, the tools we have developed over the past 20 years was done with the help of IIASA. And you can see that, in fact, let's say, when I show here, let me see how I can illuminate this here. I guess it's here. Okay. Back in 2003, we developed our first message version for Brazil. And that was done with the help of the International Atomic Energy Agency and also IIASA. And over time, we improved our message model, which is a tool developed by IIASA. And by 2010, we had a message version for Brazil with about 300 technologies represented in it. By 2010 or 12, we renamed our message 300 to message 8,000. Basically because at that time we already had some 8,000 technologies represented in our model. And now we are here, let's say we have the Blues model, which is a message-based platform with some 10,000 technologies represented into it. But not only energy, land use, agriculture. So it's really an integrated model. And also in this road here, we help Peru to have its own message model. We build a times model for Peru as well. Now we're in the process of helping Ecuador to develop a message model for Ecuador. So, in fact, let's say this partnership with IIASA has been very successful, and that's why we're very happy to be here as well. Also, we are part of this integrated assessment modeling community, and we are the only group in Latin America that's part of this community. So we are also very proud of that. Okay. Our suite of models. So over time, in the past 20 years, let's say, we started, with a message model for Brazil, which is now the Blues model, Brazilian News and Energy Systems model. We also have a global message-based model, the coffee model, and we also have a CG model. So basically, what we do now, we run a CG for the globe. This, let's say, provides some, parameters for our global message model, which splits the world in 18 different regions. And one of these 18 regions is Brazil. So by doing that, we're able to set the boundary conditions for Brazil to run Brazil inside that. And that's why when I'm going to be talking here about a 2C world or a 1.5C world, basically I'm going to run that in a global model and see what's the role of Brazil in that scenario, and then use that as a boundary condition for our model. So basically, this is our global model, splitting the world in 18 regions, and Brazil is one of these 18 regions. And also, this is an integrated model that has land use, agriculture, and energy into it. I'm not going to go into details here. So the energy part of this global model is very detailed. Let's say the land part is very detailed as well. And what about our Brazilian model? As I said, it was message 300 in the past, message 8,000, and as we have been able to incorporate, let's say, land use into it, now we call it the Blues model, and this is the model we have been using today. In the case of the energy sector, let's say we represent Brazil in 5 different regions. It's a very detailed model for the energy sector. In fact, it's the most detailed energy model you can find in Brazil. Even, let's say, in the past, we have helped ITBA, which is the energy research company of Brazil, to run scenarios up to 2050 using our model. Okay, it's very detailed in terms of transportation, industry, residential sectors, etc., etc. Not going to go into detail that. And it's also very detailed in the representation of land use in Brazil. So I'm not talking about here a soft link, but really something that's embedded in the model. Okay, what kind of use we can give to this kind of model? In fact, we were very instrumental behind the Brazilian NDC. In fact, at that time, in 2015, the Ministry of the Environment in Brazil, Isabela Teixeira, she's a former master's and PhD student in our program. So I know that IIASA also helped a lot Brazil in the preparation of NDC, but we also did a lot of work behind that. What I'm going to be showing here is exactly what I want to show. I'm going to run our global model, let's say, for a 2C world, a 1.5C world, and use this as boundary conditions for our Brazilian model. So I'm not going to go into details here, but basically, when you run this global model, we can see in a baseline how it would look like, let's say, greenhouse gas emissions over time, primary energy, land use change. So we're always, let's say, we're able to model that. And basically see that in a baseline scenario up to 2100, fossil fuels will continue to be the dominant primary energy behind that. Also, we see, let's say, deforestation will continue to be an issue in a baseline scenario. When we move to a 2C world, we begin to see that our model sees that by 2060, 2070, we need to go into negative emissions in order to be able to compensate or to stay within a carbon budget of about 1,000 gigatons of CO2 up to 2,100. And we also see the role of renewables and also the role of reforestation in the globe to, let's say, to be able to deal with a 2C scenario. Okay, I jumped too fast. In the case of 1.5C scenario, we see a similar behavior, but let's say a more accelerated trend towards negative emissions by 2050. And this is interesting because this is very much in line, let's say, for example, with the IPCC special report on 1.5 that has indicated when or by when the world will need to be negative in terms of emissions. And our model shows exactly what the IPCC said, let's say, 2 years later. Okay. Then here we see is a kind of, let's say, summary of what I have just presented. How will be emissions in a baseline scenario for the globe, how emissions in the 2C scenario would be in the world, and how would be emissions in a 1.5 scenario. So based on that, let's say, we're able to set the boundary conditions for Brazil in a 2C world, in a, let's say, least cost solution for the globe to stay within 2 degrees. There is a carbon budget that will be the optimum carbon budget for Brazil. The same thing in the case of 1.5, an optimum carbon budget for Brazil. So basically, we use these 2 carbon budgets as, let's say, the limits of emissions for Brazil, and then we allow our model to find what's the least cost solution for Brazil to stay within these 2 carbon budgets. And what's interesting here, I'm going to be showing, is that the results for Brazil to achieve this carbon budget are very different than the results for Brazil to achieve this much lower carbon budget. Okay, so this is what I just said. Let's say a carbon budget for 2C for Brazil, a carbon budget for Brazil in a 1.5C world. Not going to go into details. Let's say in a baseline solution, this is how emissions in Brazil would behave in terms of CO2 from energy, CO2 from industrial processes, CH4 from AFOLU, CO2 from AFOLU. So again, our model is very detailed, and we're able to provide this kind of information. And also in a baseline scenario, we see that basically the energy mix in Brazil would not change that much. What becomes more interesting is when we move into a 2C scenario for Brazil, then we begin to see reforestation playing a role so that net emissions in Brazil will begin to go down. If we move to, and also, let's say, as expected, let's say, we see that as expected that renewables begin to play a much important role in Brazil in a 2C scenario. If we move to 1.5C scenario, we begin to see Brazil net zero in emissions by 2060, something like that, very much associated with CCS or bio-CCS, in this case bio-CCS from energy, but also a lot of, let's say, reforestation. And also, let's say, we see that primary energy in Brazil in a 1.5C scenario is very different from primary energy in a baseline or in a 2C scenario. Okay, but I think it's more interesting to begin to compare scenarios. When you compare scenarios in terms of power generation, we see that, okay, let's look at 2050. The baseline for Brazil in 2050 for the power sector would be a profile not very much different from what's the profile of the energy or the power sector in Brazil today. In a 2C scenario for Brazil, we see that coal could play an important role, and that bios and CCS for coal would be enough for Brazil to stay within a 2C scenario. But if you want to go to a 1.5, forget coal. Really, we need to rely heavily on bio sources, sugarcane bagasse and bioenergy in general, simply because the model sees the need for bio-CCS to compensate for those parts of the economy that cannot go negative or that cannot go zero. Also, in terms of, let's say, if you talk about, let's say, the average carbon intensity of the power sector in Brazil, you see the difference between what would be the need in terms of carbon intensity for the power sector in a 2C scenario and in a 1.5C. So it's not exactly the same. It's a completely different pattern in terms of carbon emissions or carbon intensity. And more, let's say, astonishing, I would say, if you look the role of biofuels in Brazil, in a baseline, in a 2C, and in a 1.5. So what we see here, in a 1.5 scenario, the huge amount of biofuels that we needed, which is completely different, and it's interesting to see, let's say, when you compare, let's say, the amount of biofuels in a 2C scenario is not that different from the amount of biofuels in a baseline. In fact, it's about the same or even lower, simply because, let's say, we are talking about different kinds of biofuels. But in the case of 1.5C, we see here that we are going to need to have a lot of second-generation ethanol. We're going to need to have a lot of biokerosene for aviation, simply because the model sees the need for negative emissions, and everything that the model can electrify, it electrifies. So if, for example, in a 2C scenario, we can continue to have, let's say, ethanol being used in cars, because it's okay for a 2C, if you want to go to a 1.5, you have to electrify all the cars, and you have to move biofuels to those parts of the transportation sector that cannot be electrified, which is aviation and shipping. And by doing that, we're able to have, let's say, the possibility of bio-CCS. So when you look at, for example, in the case of the transport sector, passenger use, we see also the difference, let's say. What would be a 2C scenario for passenger transport in Brazil? So we see here, gasoline in a 2C scenario in Brazil would still have a role to play. Ethanol would still have a role to play. Not in the case of a 1.5. So this has huge implications for the biofuels industry in Brazil. So we have had a lot of discussion with the biofuels industry in Brazil, because basically we have to decide up front where we want to go. If you want to go to 2C, okay to keep the bio industry in Brazil as it is, producing ethanol, first generation, flexi-fuel cars, etc. But if you know up front that we want to go to 1.5, it's going to be a completely different biofuels industry. It's going to be a biofuels industry not to produce ethanol, first generation, but to produce advanced fuels like biokerosene, fuels for shipping, etc., etc. And basically, this is what we're showing. And also to show the importance of, let's say, electricity. This also has an implication for the power sector of Brazil. So it's not, and that's why I'm saying, let's say, you cannot, let's say, go to 2030, 2040, and later on decide to change. No, now I want to go to 1.5, not to 2 anymore. You cannot do that. Because if you want to electrify, let's say, the transportation sector in Brazil, you have to prepare the grid for that. And you cannot decide in the last one, now I need to. So this is an important message here, that you have to know where you want to go and work that backwards, which is very much the line or the spirit of this, the world in 2050 that IIASA is leading. Let's say you have to know where you want to go and walk backward to see how you get there. And basically the message that we're trying to show here is exactly that. So the importance of electrification, basically you have to kill ethanol in Brazil, you have to kill gasoline, because let's say even diesel or kerosene are going to be green diesel or green kerosene. So you have to change the profile of our biofuels industry to produce things that they don't produce now and basically shut down ethanol. And also, let's say, if you're not going to use gas anymore, this has huge implications for the refinery sector in Brazil. Brazil is still thinking about building new refineries. That's okay if Brazil wants to be in a 2C world. That's not okay if Brazil wants to be in a 1.5. So we are not going to need refineries, new refineries, if I'm going to go, let's say, to a 1.5C world. And also, let's say, in terms of emissions from the transport sector, again, completely different. Emissions from the transport sector in Brazil in a 2C world are not that different from a baseline. Basically saying, okay, if you want to stay within 2C, you don't need to change the transportation sector. Basically adapt it to what you have now, but it's okay. But if you want to go to a 1.5, then it's another, as I said, let's say another transportation sector. Okay. Since I still have, let's say, 5 or 10 minutes, other interesting uses for system analysis in Brazil, and we have been doing that. This was a paper we published last year in Nature Climate Change, and it's interesting because at that time, we were criticizing the previous government with the increase in deforestation in the Amazon. And basically, at that time, we criticized the government, showing that somehow the government was using the Amazon forest as a kind of bargaining to get support in Congress in Brazil to approve things that I don't think they are correct. And what's interesting about this paper here is that at that time, we produced 3 possible scenarios for deforestation Brazil in the Amazon and deforestation Brazil in the savannas or in the Cerrado. 1 year ago, let's say, we were pretty pessimistic about what we're seeing. At that time, the most likely scenario, and we're feeling very bad about that, was this intermediate scenario here. We never thought 1 year ago about a negative emission scenario. This was unthinkable. Let's say, being here in the middle of the road was bad enough. So what we did, based on the carbon budget for Brazil in a 2C world, we showed that, okay, depending upon different deforestation scenarios, provided that Brazil wants to stay within its carbon budget, if we, let's say, we have more emission from deforestation, we have less carbon space for the rest of the economy. How much that would cost? And what was the intention here? Was to show that some sectors in Brazil, let's say, industry, transportation, or the power sector, they were not paying proper attention to the problem of deforestation as if this had nothing to do with them. And that's what we want to show, that deforestation in Brazil has a lot to do with the other part of the modern economy. Because if you increase deforestation, someone you need to pay that bill. And we show which sectors will be the ones to pay that. So basically, I'm not going to spend too much time there. So what we did, we showed that in a 2C world, the carbon budget for Brazil up to 2050 would be roughly 24 gigatons of CO2. That's what this is the carbon budget for Brazil in a 2C world. And basically show, okay, in an optimistic deforestation scenario, which was something that we saw in Brazil between 2005 and 2015, when really deforestation went down in Brazil. So basically, deforestation would use this carbon space, and this amount of carbon space would be available for the rest of the economy. In that case, the cost of staying within, let's say, a 2C world would be like this cost here, okay? In relative numbers, it would be 1. Okay, Brazil would spend 1 to stay within a 2C world, provided that deforestation is under control. Last year, with increasing deforestation, or the beginning of the increasing deforestation, we were a little bit pessimistic. So what we saw for Brazil was, let's say, this amount here would be the carbon space used by deforestation. And with that, the rest of the economy would need to, let's say, stay within a much smaller budget, meaning that we need to rely on much more expensive technologies to be able to control emissions. And then there was this unthinkable scenario, would be deforestation would go up a lot, exactly what you see now. And because of that, the space for the rest of the economy would not be enough for Brazil to stay within a 2C scenario. So basically what Brazil signed in the Paris Agreement would not be able to meet. And basically show, the rest of the globe will need to do some emission reductions for Brazil. at a much higher cost that would cost for Brazil to do that. So this was the spirit of this paper here. And then we put numbers here. So we show the numbers for the different sectors, for fuels, power, industry, etc., and basically show, okay, in a strong governance scenario, which is, let's say, low deforestation, such as the deforestation we saw between 2005 and 2015, the cost for the economy would be roughly $1.2 trillion in investment between now and 2050. In a intermediate scenario of deforestation, something that we saw between 2000 and, let's say, 15 and 2018, the cost for the economy investment would be twice as much, etc. And in this weak governance scenario, which is exactly what we see now, the cost for the economy would be roughly $5 trillion for Brazil to make its part in the Paris Agreement and to pay others to do the part that Brazil is not able to do. Okay, so the experience over the years, let's say, with integrated models in our group has proved, let's say, basically the power of this kind of tools. And we have been using those kind of tools for the energy sector, for land use, and for climate mitigation. So I'd like in public here really thank IIASA for all the support we have been receiving over time. Now we involve with 4 different EU-funded projects in partnership with IIASA. So basically, if now, let's say, the Brazilian government is making deep cuts in the education, deep cuts, let's say, in scholarship for masters and PhD students, the only way we're going to be able to continue to do the kind of work we do is with the support of these international projects. So we are the lucky ones here, let's say, being able to do high-quality work, and because of that, we get external funding to do things that Brazil should be supporting us, but unfortunately, this is not the case at this point in time. Okay, thank you very much. And these nice slides came from Camila Ludovic, who is sitting here. So welcome to Rio. The weather is not that great, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. This session is, thank you.
I think we're going to have some questions now.
Yes, of course.
Okay.
Let us talk about this, please. Any questions?
My best congratulations to this presentation. And it seems that with your presentation that you get a very difficult challenge. Because in Brazil, for example, if you think Portugal doesn't have sugar cane, then it's very simple to decide for electric vehicles in order to diminish our problems with transportation. As a matter of fact, 30% of energy, all of our energy goes to transportation. 95% is road transportation. Electricity is small. It's not utilized for transportation. Very small. Maybe 2% goes to the subways and sugar cane. Well, yeah. In the last slide, it seems that ethanol has a participation, and it's very nice to converge the ethanol, that we have ethanol for transportation and electricity. I always said that, for example, Brazil is the only country in the world that can have hybrid electric vehicles with flex fuel, ethanol and gas, but they need to be plug-in because the efficiency is higher when they are plug-in. Toyota starts a vehicle.
I think there are other questions.
I would like that you comment what is the percentage of bus electric vehicles and hybrid electric vehicles when you you told us in the last slide, how do you, what is the percentage of those vehicles in these scenarios?
We have to go back to the database. I'm not going to be able to do that here, but basically what we see, by 2035, 100% of all new cars sold in Brazil would be electric. Roughly 100% of all new buses sold in Brazil by 2035 would be electric. The only parts of the transportation that will not be easily electrified are airplanes and shipping. Even in the case here of our models, we have fuel cells very much well represented in our model. So basically, for, let's say, light trucks, small ships around the coast, the model begins to see fuel cells as the way to go. So basically, again, I don't have time to go into detail, but because we have 10,000 technology into the model is able to really identify in a least cost solution what's the optimum solution for the model. Okay? Naki, please.
Okay. You mentioned that what you find is that there's a totally different focus from the 2C and the 1.C strategies for Brazil. I wonder if this is the case also for other countries you're modeling or regions, or there are some regions that it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, in fact, I would say that for most regions, it doesn't really matter. I think Brazil is a very interesting case, exactly because of this important role played by biofuels today in a different segment of society, which can be electrified. So probably in most countries, let's say a 1.5C world is an improvement of the 2C. Not in the case of Brazil. Why I think this case Brazil is really emblematic. And this was one of the conclusions of the IPCC special report on 1.5, basically somehow making distinction between 2C and 1.5, showing that 1.5 is more of the same. In the case of Brazil, 1.5 is not more of the same. Naki?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for the great talk. I have just a quick comment and then a question. I also think that the potential for electrifying the aviation is not so small. I mean, we already have small electric aircraft and hybrid, hydrogen or bioethanol, electric. I think it's a possibility. But I think, coming to the question, the big elephant in the room are the huge net negative emissions, as you know, right? and it's always difficult to wrap your head around the idea how could that really emerge. And Brazil is perhaps one of the great opportunities because of the bioethanol to remove the CO2. And I remember Moreira worked on the project to get the World Bank funding. Where do we stand with that? Because that would be the next step. I mean, to see even if that kind of bio-net negative is possible.
Yeah, in fact, Naki, two issues here. One, we're not totally happy with the size of negative emissions. So we have many students, researchers working on the details of BECS. In fact, there is a new project called Pacemaker. We just submitted a proposal 2 days ago. IIASA is also on board, which is to really look critically at BECS. This is one thing. But also, which is very specific for the case of Brazil, most of our bio-CCS here is not from the power sector. It's exactly from the biofuel sector, where in the fermentation process of producing CO2, you have such a high quality CO2, 98% CO2, the capture is very easy. And that's why in our case, let's say, it's not, let's say, traditional CCS, but really from the biofuel sector. In fact, Moreira did some work on that, but I don't think this work has evolved, but it was very important for us to get real numbers to put in our model. Yes.
Okay, Roberto, congratulations. I think this is really a fantastic case of very successful collaboration between Brazil and IIASA. Congratulations for your great talk. My question is about the paper by Rochedo on deforestation. I just want to know if it was taken into consideration the legislation that Brazil has to curb that. If we have deforestation, most of it is illegal. And I want to assume that my country will respect the laws. And if we are not respecting it now, we'll find ways to make the law be respected in the future. So I just want to know if the forest code was taken into consideration. And also, yeah, I think it's always important also to take into consideration the degree of uptake of knowledge and technology to reduce emissions in a sector that is being always on the spot, which is agriculture. I think it's impressive the number of innovations that have been incorporated in advanced agriculture in Brazil to reduce deforestation. You see the extension of no-till or minimum-till systems, the incorporation of integrated systems, crop, livestock, forestry. We have 15 million hectares of such systems. And I expect that it will grow in the future. So just to know if these two things are being considered as we model possible futures in this area.
Begin with the second one, let's say. We try the best we could to incorporate all this technology you mentioned. So let's say we have, improvement in pasture. We had, improved crops, proper use of fertilization. So we took everything under consideration to be able to feed the model with these technical details. So, of course, it's not that easy to anticipate technologies that are going to be available by 2050. But we do our best to do that. So our model is quite flexible to be able to take this into consideration. About, legislation. This was really a problem. When we run normal scenario for Brazil, the Amazon is completely out of question, so we obey by the law. So we put restrictions in our model to do that. But when we begin to saw those trends, basically there is no way to have such a rate of deforestation into the future according to the law. So in fact, basically the model shows that what we have seen in the past, if you try to put into the future, most of it is going to be illegal deforestation, which is exactly what you see now. It's crazy in the Brazilian NDC to say that we're going to have zero illegal deforestation by 2030. This is crazy. How can a country go to Perez in 2015 and say that only by 2030 we're going to have zero illegal deforestation? Illegal deforestation is zero today. You have to have targets for the legal ones, not for the illegal. So, but anyway, so in the case of these high rates of deforestation, basically the model began to do some illegal things as the real world is doing now.
Congratulations, Roberto. Are there any attempts by COPE, PPE, to promote dialogue with other models, like in the political science, precisely to address the deforestation issues, as well as the promotion of public policy in the adoption of more sustainable sources, for instance, and of course on the water, energy, and food nexus?
Yeah, in fact, I just show here, the energy part of the equation, but more and more we are working with other dimensions of sustainable development. So friend Eveline here is a postdoc in our group. She spent some time at IIASA as well. And then now we have water into our model as well. We have other students in our group that's putting air pollution into that. We have some people work with biodiversity. So basically the idea here is really to evolve into an integrated model that's able to, to contemplate the different dimensions. Behavior is very complicated. Political science, social. So this is a difficulty that this community here somehow has. How to translate, the real world into a language, a number that a model understands. What we try to do in Brazil, and we have excellent, conversations with different groups of society. For example, now we are giving very strong support for the Brazilian government for a project for the Ministry of Science and Technology. Because back between 2012 and 2016, we produced the most sophisticated study ever done in the world in terms of mitigation scenarios for a country, which was somehow behind the Brazilian NDC. And the Minister of Science and Technology was so happy with that that now they have hired us again to go into the details, what will be needed in the technology chain, in the, let's say, in the value chain for Brazil to be able to, let's say, allow those critical technologies that we have been able to identify here to make it real. So that's why, let's say, we have been lucky enough to contribute with the government of Brazil for a long time already to be able, again, coming back to IIASA, to be able to apply, let's say, mathematical tools for real energy policy. And we have been quite successful so far, and hopefully this will continue into the future. Michael?
Just when I connect the previous two talks and what you presented here, one thing that strikes me a bit is that your main message was the 1.5 and the 2 degree scenario is actually very different in what you should do even today. And in a kind of, decision making under uncertainty environment, what you would actually rather do is you do a flexible strategy, not to exactly come out with this recommendation, yes or no, for larger investments, and wait a little bit for new information to arrive, because we don't know whether the electric car or this other hydrogen car, whatever, will come online. So are you also experimenting with probably more simpler stochastic models to get insight into these more robust strategies?
Yeah, in fact, Michael, let's say we're discussing exactly this during the break. Let's say our group here from our university. This is something that we have been thinking for some time now, let's say. The improvements or the gains of running our models stochastically. But then, let's say, we have to think about, and probably IIASA has thought about that, what are the difficulties of doing that? What's the computer power to do that? But of course, we're not that happy to have this is right, this is wrong, let's say. Ideally, we have to run that stochastically. We have done this in the past for hydroelectricity in Brazil. We have a lot of experience using those models to show the vulnerability of hydroelectricity to climate change in Brazil. And we have done some runs stochastically to show, let's say, how difficult it is to model that. So I think this is a new frontier. Eventually, we can even collaborate with IIASA on that respect, because I think most models these days are run deterministically, but basically the world is not that simple. I think it's an improvement that's needed for the entire community. We are not very advanced on that. We're thinking about that, but we're not very advanced on that already.
Thank you. Well, before invite the next speaker, we need to know who has a laptop, because we need 3 or 4 groups for the next one. So I need to aggregate the 3 or 4, right? 3 or 4 groups, exactly. The people that have laptop with the people that don't have. You have? Oh, perfect things. Well, the people, please come together with the people that have laptop. No ceremony, please. Yes, we need this. 3 or 4 groups. Why? Fala em português, tá? Também. Quem tem laptop vai se juntar com as 3 pessoas. Aliás, pessoas que não têm laptop vão se juntar com pessoas que têm laptop. 3 ou 4 grupos a gente precisa. Isso. Exactly. 1 people, the group needs 2 laptop. Here we go. You have 1? Okay, you have 2. Come on, guys. Anyone. You have 1. I need you 2 people here. The Mr. have a laptop. We needed 2 next to the speaker, right? Okay. You. Okay. More 2 people with the guys, the university. Okay. I need 3 groups. Mr. Tom had 1. Well, many people had laptop. Come on, people. You don't have? Oh, okay. Mr. Tom, okay, sit side by side the people that don't have. Perfect thing. Mr. Tom with the universe. Okay, perfect thing. Here, right? Perfect. Well, the guys, 3. Just one group. Just yes. You go to over there, please, with the guys. Oh, come on, no. Okay, here we go. Move it. Okay. For a while, I call you the Nexus speaker. Yeah, okay, no problem. We have 2 groups. The one there with Mr. Tom. Okay, Mr. Sittle there. Okay, here we go. I think it is. Help me, guys. How many groups we have here with laptop? 1 group here. Laptop 2, perfect thing. 3 groups, okay. If you have 4, perfect thing. If not, 3 is necessary. Thank you. Right now, I invite our keynote speaker. I introduce you. This will be an interactive session with the audience and not a traditional keynote. Introduce Mr. Eduardo Fracassi, leader Climate Change Awareness Initiative ITBA Business School, please. As a wish. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining in. Could you please put the simulator on the screen? Later. Well, I'm sure most are worried about climate change. So we have spoken a lot about climate change. So the folks at MIT and Climate Interactive are very clever, you know. And so we have a problem, they created solution. This is called the Climate Solutions Game. And what I propose is that you actually use this simulator, which is in beta testing mode. It's not finished. There are some tweakings yet to be done. But you can use it, and you can save the world yourself. That's great. Who would pay for saving the world? So it can be done. You know, it can be done. And the issue is finding out how it can be done. And we are going to set some rules. I will explain much more or less what you have about 18 interventions here. Energy supply. Can you please give me the pointer? Oh, thank you so much. Sorry, I didn't see it. So here you have the energy sector. Here you can do many things, but perhaps you can move this knob here. Can you do it, please? Yes, move this. Yes. That means, you see that things change? What are the things here? These are different sources of energy, it seems. So you have coal, you have oil, you have gas, you have renewables, you have these ones that I don't quite read. It's very bioenergy. You can have nuclear, and you have a new promising energy source like thorium or whatever. And you can. She moved this lever, and you see. Please put it in 0 again. Move it. Yes, you know, and it changed. Coal changes. Coal is very dirty, so it's a good thing to move it down. This simulator simulates the transition. So we are going to find out the climate solutions. Here you have energy efficiency, and you have electrification, and you will be surprised. And there you have deforestation, desmatamento, afforestation, that's planting trees, and you have carbon capture and sequestration. You have all the leaks from methane, or dioxide, nitrogen, and the carbon, fluorocarbon, fluorocarbon gases. And you have also a tweaked population. What about diminishing the population, or what happens if it continues to grow. And you can also tweak about how the GDP and economic growth changes. So this is the 2 degrees zone, and this is the 1.5 zone. So are you willing to play the game? Yes? Well, please show the password and the URL, please. So link to this page, see if you, and my first question, and this is what I want you to do, and each team will provide an answer and must explain why they think that this is the most powerful intervention in the system. And you can explain to the others and share what each group learned. So you have research, you have learning, you have saving the world. It's very interesting, I think. So please. So you have enroads.climateinteractive.org. The user is guest, and the password is backshot. It works only on laptops. That's the only thing. And remember that it is a beta version. See, it will be released next month. So please access this simulator and try to find the answer to the question that I made. Which is the intervention that has a most powerful impact on global mean temperature? We can put a chronometer on the screen for 7 minutes to have them find the answer. They were very clever, and they will find the answer in only 7 minutes. Yeah. Yes, that's the proposal of this. Can you access a chronometer on the internet? Well, go to the internet. You open the Chrome or whatever. Chrome. Yes, that's it. And right here, chronometer. Oh, with C. Chronometer. Yes. Yes. And put it, make it big and start. Make it big. Control plus. Bigger. It's great. We have 7 minutes. Anyone needs help? Anyone needs help accessing the simulator? Does it work? Please show the anyone needs help with the password? Can you access it?
No, I just cannot log in into the internet.
Oh. Did anyone access the simulator? Anyone did? Oh, great. So someone did access. Backshot. Yes? And that B-U-C-K-S. No. No. It's an shot. Did you manage to enter the simulator? Let me write it.
Let me write yes.
It's you have capitals or
No.
small letters?
No, I have small letters. I can even write it here. Back shot.
Yes.
So now I can copy it from here and put it here.
Oh, try all
No,
all
right,
small letters. All small letters.
Yeah, it was all small letters.
Right, you have guessed.
Oh, guess small. Oh, guess small.
The other option could be backshot with a big capital letter.
Okay.
No, try backshot with B. Oh.
What? What did you do? tried that, but it's also not. What? Oh. Huh. Now it's something different.
But is it not? It's not to the right. It's not. It's.
Yeah, it's in roads. And Does it work for you, Michael? Let's see, maybe it works on the other.
Did it work? Sorry. I will try to find out. Did you access it? Let me help you. You have it? Oh, great. What did you do?
I think it just took a while. I don't know. All small letters. Sometimes.
Explain, please.
So guest should be all lowercase letters. The login is guest with all small letters. No capital G. No.
So please use all non-capital, small letters. Thank you. Did you manage to open it? Or it's done. The URL is there. enrose.climateinteractive.org. But it's not. It's a special beta version, so you will not get it through this. You should use that URL, not the one in the menu. Please use that one. Did you actually? You can move the 80, yes, change, but only one, and tell me which one is the level with most impact. Yes, the priority move that you would do. Change. Check it on the system, and then explain why. It's not only finding the right answer; it's explaining why it would be effective. Yes, it's not playing games. You should explain why. Otherwise, it's too easy. No, I don't know anything about climate change. I forgot everything when I started. I really don't know. What's climate change? Would you explain it to me? Oh? Yes, they're just raining. That's right. I will take a panoramic view. So if you find that a certain variable has a great impact, please try to explain why. Why does it work? You can find the cost with the graphs. You have many graphs you can consult. There is one about money. If you want to find about a cost, there is a graph about cost. So you can search it. There are many graphs. So if you take a decision and move a lever, you will actually see how the costs and financials change. Does it work? Did you find the answer to the question? Oh, that's great. But you have to think about only one measure. What's the most important measure? Only one. You must explain why. It's not only about solutions. It's about understanding why. It has to be verified and certified by scientists. It's in beta development.
Oh,
it's a beta. It's a beta. I have been using it for 5 years. In the other simulator. See roads, yes. It's not. Thank you. So, I know that we are very clever people. So by now, I think that every group has found the solution. Let's start with this group. What would you suggest as primary intervention? Only one move in the simulator.
Yeah, I can explain. So what we did, we basically relied on the carbon tax. We set it very high. So we set a very carbon price, so very high, and then we combine that with deforestation, afforestation, and carbon removal.
My question was about the first. Thank you so much. I think that you're very interesting proposal. This group, what do you think about what they say? They say that carbon price is it's an interesting move. Can you say why? Can you explain why carbon price is?
Oh yeah, we believe it's important because it's just basically incentivizing. I mean, it's a way of indirectly changing all the other interventions, because then higher carbon price means less coal, less oil, more renewables, and more new technologies.
More renewables. I don't know if you will get. I would try to check if you get more renewables. But I would see on the simulator or on the screen we will do that. So please, could you move the carbon price level to the right, please? So what happened? We have the temperature went down, but what about the energies? do we have really the green energy sector going up? Where is the laser? Do we have the green one, the green line going up or not? Yes, but you did other things. But she did that and she didn't. Oh, please. Please start again the simulator. Start it again. Start it again. Is that just move the carbon pricing to the right. Okay, you see, also the temperature goes down. Temperature goes down. You don't have more green energy. You have more or less, in fact, you have blue energy, which is natural gas as the top used energy. So why does carbon pricing work? Other groups have found a different priority move. Now all agree on carbon pricing is the first move. Yeah. Why is carbon pricing so important? Let's see. Please show the graph about energy efficiency. Go. Graph. No, go here. That one. Energy totals. Let's see energy totals and see if we have energy efficiency. Did anyone find the energy efficiency chart? Well, let's go view. Go to the Kaya graphic. View. This one. Go Kaya. So here you will find something about the energy intensity of the the carbon intensity of the energy. So this graph means that carbon goes down. And you have more, and then you have here I think that this can be a think thought of about energy efficiency. So the question now, I want you to think about these things. I will not say which the solution is, but if everyone agrees on carbon pricing, please find out which would be the second best intervention, and please go to the normal view. Normal view. Thank you. Which intervention would you suggest doing after carbon pricing? So here they say deforestation. Who votes for another move? Sorry? Who else suggests another? We go to the deforestation. Please move the lever to the left. We have 2.4. Any better move? Oh, please put the lever in the middle. Okay, and try the methane and move it down. Much more. You got 2.3. So that's a high. Those two are high leverage interventions, but maybe there are another ones. Everyone. What about taxes? What about energy and efficiency? What about subsidizing renewables? What about electrifying transportation? You can electrify transportation and buildings. Do they have a good, great what is the amount of impact that they have on temperature? find out? What would you suggest? Would you suggest deforestation or other thing? Okay. Okay. So anyone else thinks otherwise? Did you happen to hear?
Also, our suggestion is reduce deforestation and increase the electrification on buildings and industry. I'm sorry, energy efficiency of buildings and industry.
Okay. So, please, where is the? Did you find the laser? No. Perhaps I put it here. Oh, it's here. Please do this. Oh, she did it. Energy efficiency, she did it. And what else? Anything else is lacking? So I put it here. Please put this lever here. Let's see. Is this a good solution to the climate issue? What is the primary source of energy here at the end of the century? So we should do something about it. What could we do? He wants to do carbon removal. We can do it both ways, with trees or with a special technology. Carbon sequestration and utilization. We could do it. Well, tell me what to do. We're now in 1.9, but we don't have any renewables on the map. Does that make sense to you? How will you do it?
Can we add more renewables? The supply and renewables, can we go to the right?
So you can move this lever here.
Yes.
If you go here, you get renewables.
Yeah, but you don't have any effect.
What about the people? What
Yes.
about the population? What happens? Is this a good solution? What happens if this increases?
More emissions.
Well, let's move it. Move it to the right, please.
But I think it's not working, right?
Move it to the left, please. Well, you gain 1 degree, 1/10 of the degree.
Yep.
It does influence, but it's not so important in the solution, the population issue. So many people think that a population is the main issue about climate change. But we are discovering some surprises here. And what about economic growth? Let's have big economic growth. So he says something.
Yeah, I think that doesn't matter anymore because at 2100 we are at almost no emission anymore. So, but however, at that time in the future, we would still have too much carbon in the atmosphere. So the only thing that would make sense was to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Is there anything that is left to do? Seems like.
Thank you, Eduardo. Eduardo's saying, well, we are not using carbon anymore, so if you grow, no problem. Any question? Comments? How much time do we have? 25 minutes? Well, what about the other levels? Play 5 minutes with the other levels and really search for a better solutions, because some things are Could you work? You can fine-tune the carbon price. I don't know if you believe that this carbon price is feasible or not. Look for a feasible solution. But if you see that it's you could reach some kind of a scenario like this if you understand what to do. You understand what you must do now? Try to have a better more realistic scenario, please. Just take 5 minutes and we share what we learned. Something that you can do is you can click here. Please see these 3 points. Please click here. You can click here. Click here on these 3 points. And there you have more details and you have more parameters for you can fine-tune the model. You understand? If you click here, that disappears. But if you click here, you have you can see more the complexity of each intervention. So please find a better solution than this. We are learning, but perhaps is this a feasible carbon price, do you think? Discover something special? Oil. you're taxing
yes.
Oil.
Yes. Huh? Yeah, I know. Yes,
Do you want to share?
Yeah. So afforestation is giving you about 7 to 8 gigatons CO2 per year of negative emissions.
So planting trees does affect. Any question? No. Bioenergy is in the energy sector. Write it here. Write email. I will share the email of Climate Interactive, and you can actually write to them, so you can make suggestions to the model. Oh, great. You can write to them, so perhaps they can include your suggestion in the model. Okay. So any questions? Did you find anything that you would like to ask about? So, go to one. Oh, but there are measures that you can. It's a wishful thinking, but it can be done. You need really to work. You should change project management, I think, because project management is an art. It's not a side thing. It's side. You need really competent project management professionals to have something like that work. That's my thought. About the model you find? One point seven would be a great solution. Here's it. You used carbon capture and forestation. About taxing, what about taxing the... Let's think. Ended up earlier. I will try to close up now and have some questions. Yeah, because well, I would like to end up with the final interventions that you would suggest. I think that by now we're learned some things. What other suggestions would you do here on this simulation? How would you improve things? You suggest this one? Okay, so please move this slider here. So this is capturing carbon and perhaps transforming it into stone, a carbonate. You can also store it as gas, but I think it's better to do it like stones. I'm not an expert, but it feels better. What other intervention would you do? Well, it's already done. So, what about this one? Yes. It didn't move much more the number of the... But I would like to have a more balanced solution. You could do this afterwards with when the final version of the simulation is released. But you can learn a lot about, people can find by themselves the answer. So I will open now any questions that you might have about the simulator. and then we will end this session. Questions?
So twinkling with this 1.6 is the best we can get, or can we get 1.5?
Well, you know, I am a very humble person, and so I don't know anything about the simulator. You just use it till you find the best solution. Actually, I have a friend who used the simulator and made a run of different scenarios, applying an algorithm to find which would be the optimal solution. But he didn't tell me the answer, so you don't. I can't tell you. Anyone got a better solution than this one? Please explain.
See, afforestation has a synergetical behavior when you combine it with energy efficiency. So let's say, and also with nuclear. If you put nuclear all the way to the left.
To the left or to the right?
To the left, yes.
That's actually
Carbon
taxing.
price, yes.
You tax nuclear energy.
Yeah.
That's
No.
subsidy,
To the other way.
He wants the other.
Forestation, technological. And reduce the energy efficiency to status quo.
Which one?
Energy efficiency.
This one?
On transport.
So you reduce it here.
Yeah, just leave it as status quo. Wait.
So it seems energy efficiency.
Deforestation. Oh, methane. The land and industry emissions for methane, just leave it at moderately reduced.
Okay.
A little bit further to the right. About there. And what else is? Well, I got 1.5 here. I mean, coal, very highly taxed. No, the other way. And oil, very highly taxed. And natural gas, highly taxed.
So you might say this is
a
not
new
feasible.
technology all the way to the right. Well, why is it? Let me see what else. Population, low growth, energy efficiency, electrification, carbon removal. Afforestation should be more or less in the middle. Like in the middle. A little bit further. Well, somewhere around there. Let's say. Afforestation should be, let me go into the 3 points in afforestation, in the detail. It should be 50%. Okay. I think we have to twinkle with it in the details.
There's
There
difference, perhaps a minimal. And it has to do with decimals, so approximation. Any other questions?
Yes. Oh, I think this is really nice, and I'm a student of math. And my first question is about human quality life. When I saw the features, I thought, how can the quality of life of the humans being influenced by this model, or the opposite? How can we project human quality life with these models? Can you?
How would you measure quality of life?
Yes, that's a good question too.
Well,
But
because he says clean air, for example, and that's positive. This model would give you more clean air. If you want to measure GDP per capita, you can see it on the graphs. So you will. Can we go here? Graphs? I think that this, let's see, financials. This one. Total cost of energy. Let's see total cost of energy. It will be lower, so you will have to pay less for energy. Another thing, so let's see another financial. I think that there's GDP in some place. Please go here. Go here, please. And this one. This one. Global population, GDP per capita. So standard of living will go up. So when people talk about that climate, solving the climate crisis would mean economic problems, it's not proven.
Nice.
You have the Paris Accord agreement, and then you have growing GDP. So that's not an argument against climate action. That's a good question.
Nice.
What else?
No, about the framework that your team have used, because I'm studying, so I would like to copy this, to learn with this. So,
well, this is developed by MIT and a group of experts about the different disciplines that are, and the technology that's being used is system dynamics. So it's a system solution and systems methodology. And Climate Interactive is the website and the team that makes workshops and so on. And it's all open source. But before being open source, it must be certified by a panel of experts. And that is going to be done. The other simulator that we saw yesterday is certified. Any other questions?
Yes, I would like to comment. I don't have the computer, but in my expectation, when you change natural gas, it is one of the components of more influence in the CO2 equivalent, natural gas methane, and it's 20 times higher when you compose the CO2 equivalent, and of course it will give higher temperature. And when you move for higher levels of natural gas, the influence is so small, and I don't have a good explanation. My expectation, when you change natural gas, because it's 20 times higher in the composition for CO2 equivalent, it would be higher influence in temperature too.
Anyone of the experts want to answer this one? Well, I will say the following. First, natural methane is diminished here. The emissions from bovine and agriculture is diminished with this level. Carbon pricing makes natural gas more costly. So you are diminishing the use of natural gas. And you also are taxing natural gas. So the use of natural, let's go to please to the, let's go up and see to the normal graphs. You can see, go here, a view. This one, oh, it's okay. So graph, let's go to, sorry, this one, then this one, and graph. I think this one, default. You see, natural gas is blue. Use of the blue goes down. So, because you are taxing it, you are fixing the carbon price, and you are actually diminishing methane emissions. Any questions? Any other questions? Thank you for your question. Any other question? Well, I think that's all. Thank you for your attention. Great.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is time for lunch, and we'll be back as soon as possible. Right? Thank you. Okay, please enjoy your meal.